What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Mark Goes Outside, where your host, Mark, that's me, goes outside and does something awesome. And today we're going to be talking about e-bikes. Specifically, we're going to be talking about hunting with e-bikes and what type of e-bike might be the best fit for your situation. So I've got two different e-bikes here. We've got a mid-drive e-bike and we have a hub drive e-bike. I've been using both of them for a couple of years now, and I have a pretty good idea of the pros and cons of each. So let's get into the differences between them and help you decide which type of e-bike you want to buy. All right, so before we get into it, let's talk about what exactly the difference is between a mid-drive and a hub drive e-bike. So this one right here, this is a mid-drive, and as the name implies, the motor is right in the middle of the bike, right here. So the biggest difference here is that the drive to your back wheel is coming from this motor that's being transferred to your wheel through the chain. So that means that your chain and your gearing is integral to the function of this system. What is fantastic about it, though, is that because of that, you can use the different gearing on your bike to get more out of the motor in different torquing situations. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now let's look at a direct drive e-bike. A direct drive e-bike is going to have also this chain system, which is very rusty on this one because I've been using it a lot. But the biggest difference is you're not seeing a motor in the middle of the frame. The motor is back here in the center of the wheel. What's cool about these is that this motor can work independently from your chain drive. So you can pedal separate from the function of your motor. So let's talk about some of the advantages of each style of bike. I think one of the first things that's worth mentioning when you're thinking about an e-bike is the price. The hub drive e-bikes are typically a lot cheaper than your mid-drive e-bikes just because the mechanisms are a lot simpler. But cheaper does not necessarily mean worse, or I should say spending more money does not necessarily get you a better system. What it really comes down to is the style of hunting or riding that you plan to do that's going to dictate which type of e-bike is better fit for you. Now I'm going to go ahead and start by saying that I think that if you live in a place like Florida or somewhere that has relatively flat land, maybe a little bit of hills but nothing steep, the direct drive e-bike is actually going to be better for you than the more expensive mid-drive e-bike. On the other end of that spectrum, if you live in a place that has a lot of hills or steep mountainous terrain, then the mid-drive e-bike is probably going to be a better fit for you. Now the reason for that is because the direct drive e-bike has really one major downfall, and that is that it will output the same amount of torque no matter what situation you're in. And all that you're doing with your chain drive, with your pedals, is assisting the torque that's already being output. So if you find yourself in a situation where you need that extra torque, you're not going to be able to get it. So if you're climbing up a steep hill, or if you find yourself in a muddy situation, this bike might struggle a little bit. Whereas your mid-drive e-bike, you can just drop that thing into a low gear and get all the torque that you want and just pedal right through those steep hills or those muddy, sticky situations. Now, while this is a major advantage of a mid-drive e-bike, you know, being able to use those gears and use the power of your motor through different gear ratios, it is the only advantage to this style bike. Other than that, the mid-drive e-bike, in my opinion, falls short on everything else, at least from a hunting perspective. If all you're building this for is joyrides, then the mid-drive e-bike is probably the best bang for your buck, because it feels the most like you're actually riding a bike, because you're just pedaling along and this motor is going to assist your pedaling. It's going to help you pedal better. And for some weird reason, it just feels more direct. It feels like you're really just riding a bike that's for some weird reason is just so much easier to ride. Not to mention that the weight is more centered in the bike, and that's just gonna make everything handle better when you're doing some like off-road riding. But for hunting, this has plenty of disadvantages. Let's talk about those. Now, oftentimes when you're hunting, you're going to be crossing a variety of different terrain to get to the spots that you need to get to where you're going to be hunting. And that means that you need a bike that can handle a lot. Whereas the mid-drive e-bike is really well equipped for handling that steep terrain. This e-bike can handle all kinds of terrain. And when I say all kinds, I'm really mostly talking about wet terrain. The hub drive e-bike is far better equipped for wet conditions. Especially here in Florida, that's a major advantage. So one of the main reasons that this bike is better equipped for going through water is because the motor sits higher. See, look, if we get our tape measure, the spindle, the center point of that motor, sits at about 15.5 inches. When we look at this bike here, this bottom bracket is actually only sitting at like 11, 12 inches. So it's really low to the ground. So having that motor sitting in the middle of the wheel raises it much higher than where it's at when it's here. Keep in mind, it's actually sitting below that spindle. So this mid-drive motor is actually only 8.5 inches from the ground. So that gives you a lot less clearance before your electronic parts start getting wet. So riding through water with this thing is basically impossible. Another advantage to having the motor inside of this wheel is that these really fat tires, they almost work like the bow of a boat when you're going through water. They actually push a wake out of the way. And so what it does is it creates sort of higher water in front of the wheel and then lower water behind the front of the wheel as that water is being pushed out of the way. So you could be going through relatively deep water, but the water level inside of the rim will actually be lower than the rest of the water. So it takes a while before you get deep enough to where this motor is going to be submerged. Whoa, that was a little deep. The problem with having the mid-drive motor is that you get the opposite effect. When you're going through, you get that higher water in front of your front wheel, lower water in the middle, and then as it comes around the back, it actually gets higher again. So this motor is sitting sort of right in the wake that's being created by the bike. So that water, again, is closer to that motor. So again, the biggest disadvantage here is that if you try and ride through water, that motor's going to get wet pretty quickly in pretty shallow water. Inevitably, there's going to come a time when you reach water that's just way too deep for any of these bikes. So when I run into that with the direct drive motor, this is typically how I go through it. I just get off the bike and I literally pick up the back end of the bike. It's a little bit tedious, especially when you've got a bunch of weight sitting on the back here, and you just walk through like this, and that's how you keep your motor from getting wet. With the mid-drive bike, there is actually a way that you can walk through deep water that gets the motor actually way higher up and much easier than the other way. The other way I just showed you, we're picking up the back end of the bike and we're having to carry it through the water. With this one, every single e-bike has what they call a walk mode. If you push the negative shift button and hold it down, it'll start crawling forward so that when you're walking next to it, you don't have to push it along. So you push that button, the bike will stand itself up, and you can literally just push that button and just walk through the water like this. And look how high up that motor is. It's way out of the water. So this is one way that you can deal with high water when you're using a mid-drive e-bike. So your mid-drive e-bike has a major disadvantage when it comes to riding through water. Now let's talk about what is, in my opinion, the absolute biggest disadvantage of a mid-drive bike, and that is that the function of your motor is solely dependent on this chain. if your chain breaks, or if any of your shifting gears components, like your derailleurs, break, then you're left high and dry. You have to walk out. You can't even pedal out if you wanted to, because your chain is gone. Everything goes through that chain, whether it's you pedaling or the motor pushing you along. Now, with that said, when you're riding through like grass and stuff, a lot of times that grass gets stuck in this derailleur, and that derailleur can get jammed up. And Danny actually had an issue where he was riding one of these mid-drive bikes. His derailleur got jammed up and he broke the derailleur off. And then he had to walk back to the truck like 5 or 6 miles. So that is the major disadvantage of the mid-drive e-bike. Now let's look at the hub drive. So in this regard, the hub drive e-bike wins again, because your hub drive is one mode of propulsion, and your chain not transmission, but your chain line is another mode of propulsion. So if your motor dies on you for whatever reason, like if it has an electrical issue or a sensor failure, then you can pedal back to the truck. If your chain breaks, you can still throttle. Like I always carry my throttle with me, not hooked up, because technically it is illegal if you're in Florida to use a throttle on public land. But I keep the throttle in my bag just in case I find myself in an emergency situation where I have to hook that thing up, and I can ride back to the truck with just my throttle. And if I get a fine while doing that, then so be it. But that prevents me from having to walk like 6 or 7 miles to get back to the truck when I'm way out there with an e-bike. So if you're spending most of your time riding in relatively flat or swampy terrain, then your hub drive e-bike is going to be the best choice in my opinion. However, if you're spending most of your time riding in steep and dry terrain, then your mid-drive e-bike is going to be the best option for you. I hope you guys found this information helpful, and maybe do me a favor and send it to one of your friends that might be thinking about buying an e-bike as well. Please go ahead and subscribe. There's going to be plenty of other related content, and yeah, I guess hit that like button or whatever, and subscribe. I said that already, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.